The snow had fallen for 3 days without pause, a merciless blanket of white swallowing the Montana plains. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, curling around the sagging fence lines of the McAllister ranch like a mourning song. Inside the lonely cabin, a single lantern flickered against rough-hewn log walls, its glow stretching over a cradle by the hearth. Inside that cradle, a baby girl whimpered weakly, her tiny breaths thin and broken, the sound of a life slipping away. Her father, Elias McAllister, sat slumped beside her, his hands trembling as he tried to warm a bottle against his chest. He had lost his wife, Clara, 2 months earlier in childbirth. Since then, the man who once rode the range with steady eyes and a laugh like sunlight had been hollowed out, left with nothing but a baby too young to feed and a grief too heavy to carry. He whispered his wife's name sometimes into the wind, but it never answered. The ranch that had once thrived under his hands was now buried in snowdrifts. The cattle were penned up tight, hay dwindling fast, and Elias himself had barely eaten in 2 days. His focus had narrowed to the baby, Little Rose, named for the wildflowers that grew by Clara's grave. She was all he had left, and yet she was slipping from him too. The milk cow had gone dry weeks ago, and the few tins of condensed milk from town had run out yesterday morning. He'd tried to mix cornmeal and water, but the child's stomach had rejected it. Her cries had turned to faint whimpers, her skin pale as the frost creeping up the window panes. Elias sat there, head bowed, praying for something, anything, while snow rattled against the shutters like ghostly fingers. "Please, God," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't take her too." Not her. But outside there was no sign of mercy. The blizzard raged, burying the world in silence and white. Time lost its shape. Elias dozed in and out, clutching the baby to his chest for warmth, drifting between waking and fevered dreams of Clara's face. The hours stretched thin until sometime near dawn, a sound pierced the storm. A knock. At first he thought it was the wind, or perhaps the house creaking under snow. But then came another knock, firmer, followed by a woman's voice shouting through the storm, "Elias McAllister!" "Open up, it's me, Mara." For a moment he thought he'd imagined it. Mara Caldwell was his nearest neighbor, though near in these parts meant 3 miles of rough trail and 1 frozen creek between their homesteads. A widow herself, she had come west 2 years ago with her father, only to bury him before the first winter. Since then, she had lived alone, tending to her small plot with the kind of quiet resilience that men like Elias both admired and pitied. He hadn't seen her since before Clara died. He stumbled to the door, baby in one arm, fumbling with the latch. The cold rushed in like a living thing when he opened it. Snow whirled in, blinding him, but through it he saw her, Mara wrapped in a wool cloak, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes burning with determination. "I saw your smoke," she gasped, stepping inside before he could speak. "And I heard the baby. I couldn't stay home knowing." She stopped when she saw the child's limp little hand hanging from his arm. "Oh, Elias," he tried to explain, but his voice failed. All he could manage was, "She won't eat. She's fading." Mara dropped her gloves, stripped off her cloak, and went straight to the hearth. She took the baby gently, holding her close, checking her face, her breathing. There was no fear in her movements, only quiet purpose. "You fool of a man," she murmured, her tone half tender, half scolding. "You should have sent for me days ago." She unpinned her shawl, sitting on the edge of the bed. Then, with a glance that silenced his protest, she said softly, "Let me feed her." Elias blinked, not understanding at first. Then realization struck. He hesitated, pride and grief warring in his chest. "Mara, you don't have to—" "Hush," she said, her voice low but steady. "There's no shame in saving a life." The wind howled outside, but inside a strange stillness settled. Mara cradled the baby to her chest, humming softly, the sound of her voice weaving through the crackle of the fire. The baby stirred, her tiny lips seeking warmth and life. And for the first time in days, Elias heard something he thought he never would again. A soft, hungry cry. Tears filled his eyes, blurring the sight of Mara bent over his daughter like an angel sent through the storm. He turned away, one hand over his mouth, his body shaking. Not from the cold, but from the sudden, unbearable flood of relief. The snow kept falling outside, heavy and endless, but inside the cabin, a fragile warmth began to bloom. For the first time since Clara's death, Elias felt something stir inside him, something like hope. He looked back at Mara, her hair loosened from her braid, the firelight gilding her face. She glanced up and caught his gaze, a faint, weary smile curving her lips. "She'll live now," she whispered. "But you need to live too, Elias. She'll need her father." Outside, the storm began to quiet, as if even the wind itself bowed before the fragile miracle inside that lonely ranch house. The storm did not let up that night. The wind screamed against the cabin walls as though the world itself meant to break them apart. But inside, a strange calm had settled, a tender bubble of warmth in a frozen wilderness. The baby slept at last, tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm against Mara's shoulder. She had wrapped the child in her shawl, humming old lullabies under her breath. Elias sat near the hearth, elbows on his knees, watching the fire dance and throw gold light across her face. He had never noticed how soft her eyes were, or how strong her hands looked when holding something fragile. Maybe grief had blinded him, or maybe the storm outside had stripped away everything except what mattered. Mara had come through the blizzard on foot, leading her horse part of the way through waist-deep snow. She had risked her life to reach his door. That truth sat heavy in his chest. When he told her as much, she just shook her head, poking at the fire with a stick. "I couldn't stay home knowing you were here alone with a starving baby," she said simply. "The good Lord wouldn't let me rest." He tried to thank her again, but words felt too small. The baby stirred, and Mara's voice softened to a whisper. "Hush now, little Rose. The storm's just singing you to sleep." Elias looked around the cabin, the unwashed dishes, the pile of half-split logs, the smell of loneliness hanging heavy in the air. And for the first time, he saw it through her eyes. It wasn't just a home. It was a man drowning in sorrow. He cleared his throat. "I haven't done right by the place," he said quietly. By her. Mara didn't scold or pity. She just looked at him with a kind of steady gentleness that made his chest ache. "You did what you could," she said. "Grief takes a man apart before it lets him start again." He turned toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass like cold hands, but the light from the fire made it sparkle like stars caught in frost. "Clara would have liked you," he murmured after a moment. Mara smiled faintly. "I met her once in town. She said you built this cabin with your own hands." "I did," he said. "For her." His voice broke on the last word. Silence fell. Not cold, not awkward, but deep. The kind that holds more truth than talking ever could. Mara reached over, touched his arm lightly. "Then you build the rest for your daughter," she said. "That's what Clara would want." Her touch lingered, gentle but electric. Elias felt something stir that he hadn't felt since before the grave dirt covered his wife. The pulse of life moving through him again. It frightened him, that flicker of warmth. He didn't know if it was wrong to feel it, or if it was the first mercy he'd been given in months. As the hours dragged on, the wind howled harder. The firewood pile dwindled. Mara rose to fetch more from the shed, but Elias stopped her with a hand on her sleeve. "You're not going out there," he said firmly. "I'll go." "You'll freeze before you make it halfway," she argued. "You're exhausted." "So are you," he countered. They stood close, arguing softly while the storm battered the roof above them. Then, without meaning to, Elias reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His hand lingered. The world seemed to still around them. Just the two of them, the baby asleep, the fire whispering between heartbeats. Mara didn't pull away. Her eyes met his, full of something unreadable. Not pity, not charity. Something warmer. Something dangerous. He stepped back first, swallowing hard. "You should rest," he muttered. "I will." "But only if you sit beside me," she said. He hesitated, then nodded. They sat together near the hearth, the cradle between them, the storm beyond. Mara talked softly about her father, about the farm she'd grown up on in Missouri, about how she missed the smell of lilacs and the sound of church bells on Sundays. Elias found himself listening like a starving man at a table. She spoke of loneliness like someone who'd made peace with it, and yet there was a spark in her that had never gone out. When the baby stirred, Mara reached for her again. Elias watched as she soothed the child with practiced ease, her voice low and melodic. "You've done this before?" he asked quietly. Mara's eyes softened with a shadow of sadness. "No," she said. "But I helped my sister raise hers before she passed." "I'm sorry," he murmured. She smiled faintly. We all lose someone. But sometimes if we're lucky we find someone too. Elias looked at her then. Really looked. At the quiet strength in her shoulders. The tired light in her eyes. The small tender smile that made the cabin feel less like a tomb. Maybe you're right, he said softly. The storm raged on, but warmth grew between them. Slow, quiet, dangerous in its tenderness. By the time the fire burned low, the baby slept soundly, and Mara leaned her head against the wall beside the cradle. Her eyes fluttered closed. Elias watched her for a long time, the lines of her face gentled by firelight. He reached out, pulling a quilt from the bed and draped it over her shoulders. He stood there a moment, looking down at her and the baby, his whole world, now bound up in this fragile, fleeting peace. Outside, the wind screamed like a widow at a grave, but inside the cabin he heard only the slow crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of two souls who had brought his world back from the edge. As he turned to bank the fire, Mara stirred in her sleep, whispering something he almost didn't catch, a soft murmur of his name. It struck him deep, that sound, like the faintest promise buried beneath the snow. Elias lay down near the hearth, his heart uneasy, his mind a whirl of guilt, gratitude, and something that might one day become love. The storm went on till morning, but for the first time in months he slept without dreaming of loss. When Elias woke, the storm had spent itself. The world beyond the window was silent. A vast white stillness stretched across the plains, sparkling under the pale gold of dawn. Frost clung to the glass and smoke rose straight from the chimney, unbroken by wind. For the first time in weeks the sun shone, soft and shy, as if afraid to disturb the peace it had found. Inside the cabin, the fire was low but steady, filling the air with the faint scent of cedar smoke. Mara sat by the cradle, her hair falling loose over one shoulder, eyes half closed in the dim light. The baby lay bundled in her shawl, breathing deep and easy, a faint pink blooming in her cheeks again. Elias watched them quietly for a long while, afraid that if he moved, the fragile magic of that moment would break. It had been a lifetime since his home had felt alive. Since laughter, warmth, and the rhythm of a woman's hands had filled the space Clara once ruled. But now somehow that emptiness felt softened. Not healed, not forgotten, but softened. Morning, he said softly. Mara looked up, blinking as though pulled from a dream. Morning, she whispered back, voice rough from sleep. She followed his gaze to the window. Looks like the storm's done its worst. Elias crossed the floor, peering out at the white horizon. The fences were buried halfway up. The barn roof bowed under drifts, and the creek beyond had frozen solid. Yet the sight didn't fill him with dread the way it might have yesterday. Maybe it was the sun, or maybe it was the quiet presence behind him. The sound of a woman's breathing where only silence had lived. He turned back to her. You should eat, he said. I've got biscuits, beans, maybe a little jerky left. She smiled faintly. I'll take whatever you've got, but only if you eat too. He found himself smiling back, something small and unpracticed tugging at his lips. He fetched the food, reheated it over the coals, and they ate together in easy quiet. The baby stirred now and then, and each time she did, Mara's face softened. She'd scoop the child up, and whisper little nonsense words that made Elias's heart twist in ways he didn't recognize. After breakfast, he bundled himself in his coat to check the stock. The air outside bit through leather and wool, sharp as glass, but it was clean, the kind that filled a man's lungs and made him feel alive again. He shoveled a path to the barn, the crunch of snow under his boots steady and sure. Inside, the horses stamped nervously. The old milk cow lowed at him, thin and restless. He stroked her flank, murmured softly, and for the first time in days, felt something like purpose settle back into his bones. When he returned to the cabin, Mara was rocking by the fire with the baby in her arms, singing an old tune in a voice low and full of warmth. She looked up at him as he entered, and the morning light caught her eyes, green as meadow grass under frost. Something in that look stopped him cold. He didn't know if it was gratitude or something deeper. She's strong, Mara said, smiling down at the baby. She's got your stubbornness. Elias chuckled softly. Or yours. She tilted her head. Maybe both. There was a quiet then, the kind that doesn't ache but hums, warm and alive. He sat near her, close enough to feel the heat from her shoulder, close enough that the faint scent of her wood smoke and wild sage filled his head. "Mara," he said after a while. "You didn't have to risk yourself to come here." Her gaze stayed on the fire. "I know. Then why did you?" She hesitated, her hands tightening around the child. "Because I've been where you are, alone, losing someone. It carves a hole in you, Elias. And if someone doesn't reach in and pull you back, you stay there." She looked up at him, her voice trembling just slightly. "I couldn't let you stay there." He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "I'm grateful," he said, but the words felt too small. Her eyes softened. "Grateful's a start." They shared a small laugh then, quiet, shy, but real. It was the first sound of happiness in that house since Clara's laughter had faded. By midday, the sun shone brighter, and Mara helped Elias clear snow from the door and feed the livestock. She worked with steady rhythm, her skirts tucked up, cheeks flushed from the cold. Watching her, Elias realized something that both comforted and scared him. He didn't feel alone anymore. The sight of her moving through his home, the sound of her voice calling softly to the animals, it all felt so natural, as if she'd always belonged there. Later, as dusk began to creep back over the hills, Mara prepared to leave. The storm had passed, the sky clear enough for her to find her way home. She bundled the baby tight, pressing a kiss to the child's forehead before handing her to Elias. "She's strong now," she said. "Keep her warm and she'll see spring." Elias nodded, his heart heavy at the thought of her leaving. "Mara," he said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you." "Then don't," she said with a soft smile. "Just live. That's thanks enough." She turned to go, wrapping her cloak tight. The snow crunched beneath her boots, the air still and cold. Elias watched her step into the pale twilight, the hem of her cloak catching the last of the sunlight. He wanted to call out, to ask her to stay just a little longer, but pride and fear held his tongue. It wasn't until she disappeared down the trail that he realized the cabin felt colder again, emptier somehow. The fire still burned, the baby still slept, but the warmth she'd brought seemed to drift away with her. He stood at the window long after she was gone, watching the horizon fade into blue shadows. Then just before darkness took the last light, he whispered her name, softly like a prayer, and promised himself he'd see her again before the week was out. Outside, the snow glittered under a shy crescent moon, and deep within the cabin, the baby stirred, her tiny hand reaching toward the firelight, as if she too longed for the warmth that had just walked out into the cold. The next days came gentle but cold, the world still wrapped in snow and silence. Each morning Elias woke to the sight of his daughter sleeping soundly, her small fists curled near her chin, a faint smile twitching on her lips. It was as if the baby herself had felt Mara's warmth settle into her bones, a promise that she would live. Yet every time Elias looked out the window toward the north ridge, where Mara's homestead lay, his heart gave a restless tug. The memory of her voice, the quiet way she'd filled his empty rooms, lingered like the echo of a hymn. By the third morning, he could stand it no longer. He saddled his horse before dawn, wrapping his coat tight, a sack of dried beans, candles, and kindling tied behind him. The trail was still heavy with snow, but the sky was clear, the stars fading into pale blue as he rode. The world felt hushed, only the soft creak of leather and the muffled thud of hooves breaking the stillness. His breath clouded in the air like smoke, and with each mile he found himself rehearsing words he might say when he saw her. "Thank you" felt too small. "I missed you" too dangerous. So he settled for silence, letting the rhythm of the ride speak for him. Mara's cabin appeared just as the sun touched the ridge, its roof draped in white, a curl of smoke rising steady from the chimney. She was outside, chopping wood, her hair tucked beneath a wool hood, her movements sure and strong. When she looked up and saw him riding through the snow, her eyes widened. Surprise first, then a smile so genuine it caught him off guard. "Elias McAllister," she called, setting down the axe. "You'll freeze yourself to bone riding this early." He dismounted, boots sinking deep in the drift, and tipped his hat with a grin that felt strangely boyish. "Brought you some things," he said. "Figured the storm might have left you short." She laughed softly, brushing hair from her face. "I should have known you'd repay kindness with a supply run." "Just good manners," he said. Though the warmth in his voice betrayed something deeper, she led him inside. The cabin small but tidy, shelves lined with jars, a quilt folded over a chair, the air smelling faintly of pine and soap. The fire burned bright, casting gold across the rough-hewn walls. He stood awkwardly near the hearth while she unpacked the supplies, her movements quiet but graceful. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said, not looking at him. "I wanted to," he admitted. "Couldn't rest easy not knowing you were out here alone." That made her pause. She turned to him, eyes searching his face. "I've been alone a long time, Elias. Doesn't scare me much anymore." He shifted, meeting her gaze. "It should," he said softly. "No one should have to face a winter like this alone." Something flickered in her eyes. Not sadness exactly, but recognition. "You're one to talk," she murmured. "You've been doing just that." He smiled faintly, stepping closer. "Not anymore." The words hung between them, simple but heavy with meaning. Mara's breath caught. She turned away first, pretending to busy herself at the stove. But Elias saw the faint tremor in her hands. They shared coffee by the window, the steam fogging the glass while the snow outside glittered beneath the sun. Mara talked about her garden plans for spring, about planting wildflowers by her father's grave. And Elias listened, each word painting a future he hadn't dared imagine. He told her of his herd, his hopes of rebuilding, how Rose had begun to coo and smile again. When he mentioned the baby's laugh, that soft, bubbling sound, Mara's eyes filled with tears. "She's strong because you are," she said gently. He looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "She's strong because of you." The quiet that followed was not empty but full, of warmth, gratitude, and something neither dared name. When it came time for him to leave, the sun was already dipping low, staining the snow in shades of pink and gold. Mara walked him to the gate, her cloak drawn close, the wind lifting strands of her hair. "Thank you for the visit," she said softly. "Thank you for everything else," he replied. They stood there, silent, stretching between them, breaths mingling in the cold. He wanted to reach for her, to take her hand, to tell her that somehow in saving his child she had saved him too. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat and turned toward his horse. "Elias," she said suddenly, and he stopped. Mara hesitated, then stepped closer. Her eyes were luminous in the fading light. "You don't have to wait for another storm to come calling," she whispered. He met her gaze, heart hammering in his chest. "Then you don't wait for me to knock," he said. For a moment, neither moved. Then softly she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that could melt 1,000 winters. He mounted his horse, looked back once, and saw her still standing there, cloak fluttering in the wind. A figure of grace and quiet courage. As he rode home through the twilight, the snow around him seemed to glow with a faint otherworldly light. The air was cold, but inside he felt warm for the first time in a long, long while. The world, once hollow, now pulsed with something alive, the faint, trembling heartbeat of hope. That night, after putting Rose to bed, he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Mara's voice echoed in his mind. "You don't have to wait for another storm." He smiled, whispering to himself, "And then I won't." Outside, the snow fell softly again, not cruel this time, but gentle, as if the land itself was blessing what had begun. Winter loosened its hold slowly that year, as if reluctant to let go of the world it had frozen in silence. Days grew longer, and the drifts around the ranch melted into glittering rivers that ran down toward the valley. The air smelled of thawing, earth and wet pine. Somewhere beyond the hills, geese called their return. Elias watched the change from his porch with the baby in his arms, her cheeks pink, her laughter bright as the creek. He'd lived through many winters, but never one that had given him so much, or taken him so close to grace. Since that day by her gate, he had seen Mara often. At first, under the polite pretense of neighborly errands, trading candles for flour, mending a fence, checking stock. But each visit stretched longer, each departure lingered. They spoke of small things, the cattle, the weather, the stubbornness, of life. Yet beneath every word lay an unspoken rhythm that both of them felt but dared not name. One evening in late March, when the last patches of snow clung stubbornly to the hillsides, Elias found himself saddling his horse again. the same nervous flutter in his chest he'd felt the first time. The sky glowed with that tender gold that comes only at the edge of spring. He carried no excuse this time. No supplies, no reason but truth. Mara's cabin stood warm against the dusk, smoke curling from the chimney, the sound of a fiddle faint through the door. When she opened it, surprise lit her face, quickly replaced by something softer, a quiet knowing. "Elias," she said, smiling, "you come bearing no storm this time." "Just a restless heart," he answered before he could stop himself. Her smile faltered, her eyes searching his. "Then come in before the night chills it." Inside, lamplight spilled across the room, catching the dust motes that danced like golden snow. The fiddle rested on the table beside a half-mended shawl. He stood awkwardly at first, hat in hand, until she poured coffee and motioned for him to sit. They spoke of Rose, of calves soon to be born, of how the river ice had finally cracked. But beneath every sentence his heart pounded with words he hadn't yet said. Finally, she set down her cup. "You've something on your mind," she said gently. Elias looked at her, the firelight flickering across her face. "You know me too well." "I've seen you in storm and silence," she replied. "That tends to teach a person something." He leaned forward, hands clasped. "When I lost Clara, I thought my life was over. I built these walls to keep the world out, and I would have let the cold take me if not for that knock on my door." His voice roughened. "You walked through the worst blizzard of my life and brought my daughter back from the edge. You brought me back." Mara's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Elias took a breath that felt like crossing a line between the man he'd been and the man he wanted to be. "I've tried to tell myself that what I feel for you is just gratitude, but it isn't. It's something deeper, something that grows stronger every time I hear your voice or see you hold Rose. You've filled this place with light again, Mara. And if you'll let me, I'd spend whatever years I've got left trying to keep that light alive." For a long moment, the only sound was the fire. Mara looked down at her hands, then back up, and the tears she'd been holding slipped free. "Elias," she whispered, "I told myself I was done loving anyone. That losing was easier if you never began. But the day I heard your baby cry through that storm, something in me broke open. And when you looked at me by that hearth, I knew I'd found the peace I'd been missing." She rose slowly, crossing the small space between them. The lamplight shimmered against her tears. Elias stood too, heart thundering. When she reached him, she hesitated only a heartbeat before resting her hand against his cheek. "You saved me too," she said softly. He covered her hand with his, rough palm against gentle fingers. "Then maybe we keep saving each other," he murmured. Outside, snow began to fall again. Soft, unexpected, the last snow of the season. It drifted past the window like a blessing. Mara looked toward it and smiled. "Seems winter doesn't want to say goodbye." "Let it linger," Elias said. "This time, it feels kind." She laughed, the sound breaking through the quiet like a promise. He drew her close then, careful, reverent, his arms circling her as though she were something sacred. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath. For the first time since the world had gone cold, he felt completely warm. They stood like that for a long while, the room bathed in firelight and falling snow. When Mara finally spoke. Her voice was a whisper against his heart. "Does this mean I'm to visit more often?" He smiled into her hair. "No," he said. "It means you don't ever have to leave." Later, when he rode home through the soft snow, the night seemed alive with silver light. The stars burned. Clear, the air carried the scent of thawing earth, and somewhere behind him, a lamp still glowed in Mara's window. At his cabin, Rose stirred in her cradle, cooing softly as if she already knew the world had changed. Elias bent to kiss her tiny brow and whispered, "You've got a mother watching over you now, little one." Outside, dawn began to bloom, gold spilling over the white hills, the snow melting beneath its touch. In that fragile light, two sets of footprints met at the crossroads between the ranches and disappeared together toward the sunrise. And in the hush of the waking world, the widowed rancher finally learned what it meant to live again. Not by forgetting the love he'd lost, but by opening his heart to the love that had come walking through the snow. The end.